Here we are, we're going to be talking about following Christ above everything. Above everything. He is the highest priority. You know, God is in control. Now, if you thought somebody else was in control, I'm just going to be the one to joyfully tell you, no, that's not the case. God is in control. Now, you may have thought about a number of people being in control. The government, pharmaceutical companies are controlling. They're going to throw out this new, or several different companies are creating this new vaccine, if you will. Facebook and YouTube editing what you're allowed to see and so forth. They're not the ones in control. God is in control. Matter of fact, I went to a pastor's meeting yesterday and several ministers were talking together, and I don't know how it came up, but one of the ministers asked which club the other minister is in. And the other minister said, "What do you mean? What club?" And they said, "You know, are you in the club?" And they were talking to this guy. "Are you in the club that you're in charge at your house, or is your wife your boss?" And, you know, it's amazing. All of the husbands whose wives were not present were in charge at their house. All of the husbands whose wives were present told the truth. You may think people are in control and in charge, but the end result is that God is in charge. As believers, we can be assured of everything, that God is in control. Now, I am somewhat of an aficionado of history, and I don't know if you know what historic event we are celebrating this weekend. You may say, "Oh, it was this or the other thing." Just this last week, I was celebrating an anniversary. On Thursday, my wife and I celebrated 32 years of marriage. This last week, also on July 30th, was the day in which we came to be pastors of the church 14 years ago. I like historic events that are personal, but also historic events that go back in time. Let me tell you, on the evening of July 30th, 1914, that was the day that began World War I. That was the day, and it was on August the 1st, yesterday, it was August the 1st, by the way, that Russia failed to comply with a demand, and that's when Germany declared war on Russia. And then on the next day, on August the 2nd, France went to war and declared war, and it was one thing after another that was taking place. So World War I, of all, this was the war to end all wars. How many know that didn't happen? It was a war to end all wars, finally ended in November 11th of 1918. So for 4 years, it went from July, or 1st of August, 2nd of August. This was the day France was declaring war 106 years ago. But I started to put pieces together. You know, how many times do we look at, with a microscope, one little event and say, "Oh, that was interesting." But if you step back and you start to look at global events that were taking place, it can start to shed a little bit more light on it. Let me give you the actual timeline that I want to share with you here in this day. First of all, let's just look at some of the devastating things that were taking place. These are pictures out of World War I. Here's pictures out of World War I. This was not yesterday. This was 106 years ago. Another picture. Could you imagine a day where there are patients everywhere? Now, the patients that are in these pictures are because of the Spanish flu that was also part of World War I at the end in 1918. The world was suffering from the Spanish flu. This doesn't look familiar at all, does it? This was Seattle. These were the police in Seattle, Washington in December of 1918. Because of the Spanish flu that was going around. I know you've never been in an environment where you saw face masks on people, right? God is in control. Now, why do I share this? Because simultaneously taking place during World War I and during the Spanish flu, World War I, as I said, started in 1914, August 1st, if you will, August 2nd. Well, in that same year of 1914, in April, there met a group of around 300 ministers in Hot Springs, Arkansas. That was the birth of the Assemblies of God that day, that week, if you will, in April. And they gathered together to form just a loosely knit union to be able to promote the gospel. Well, it's interesting because in that group, and here's a picture of that group, but in that group, I want to go back because I don't want you to read that yet. I don't trust you. In that group, then it was the first time and only time that the Assemblies of God had two general councils in the same year. Because later on in November, so if you were to think about this, April, they start the Assemblies of God. August 1st, the World War I begins. And then in November, they're going to have another general council. Now, can you imagine what was going on in their minds? The world was upside down. I mean, this was the war to end all wars. If you were to put it into just some statistics, if you combine all of the deaths that were in World War I, which was a heavy casualty war, connected with, at the same time, the Spanish flu, which was prevalent at that time, roughly 10% of the world's population at that time died. Now, can you imagine how much of an impact? Can you imagine how it would impact the churches having people out on the street wearing face masks? They're being told that it's dangerous to meet together. They're telling them that it's all upside down. You could imagine how that would affect people. Can you? Well, so in November, they gathered together again. And in November, they were trying to establish certain things, and the meeting took place for an entire week. That entire week-long meeting that took place in Stone Church in Chicago. It was the largest Pentecostal church in the time, and they were the ones that would be able to meet together because they were expecting about 1,000 people. And it was going to last for a week long. And in that week-long time, they had all kinds of people trying to develop ideas of how to minister in the middle of calamity because the world was falling apart. And they were saying, what are we going to do about all of this? And in the middle of that, they said, what we're going to do is we're going to try to reach some of the lost. And what they planned on doing was the last day of General Council in November of 2000 or 1914, November 29th, the last day of that General Council, they were going to receive a special offering that was going to send off to the missionaries. Makes sense, right? The Assemblies of God is missions minded. Well, that's what you all think. Well, the reality is the pastor of Stone Church came that day, and he said, you know what? This is costing my church a lot to host all of these people. So I'm not going to be able to let you have the offering. We need, as a church, to receive the offering for us. Now, could you imagine what would happen in leadership's mind? They're like, oh, well, that's not. And so something that was not on the agenda took place. Because they weren't going to receive one offering. They were going to have to do something different. And so I'll give you the next thing. This is the declaration that came out of the second General Council of the Assemblies of God, which was not part of the agenda. It wasn't part of the agenda. In that council, it says, and this was the exact way it was written, as a council, we hereby express our gratitude to God for his great blessing upon the movement in the past. We are grateful to him for the results attending this forward movement, and we commit ourselves and the movement to him for the greatest evangelism the world has ever seen. We pledge our hearty cooperation, prayers, and help to this end. That day, November 29th, in the General Council of the Assemblies of God, they established the Department of Missions. They weren't able to do one offering, so they established an entire Department of Missions. And that first year, a certain amount came in. The second year, a certain amount came in. In 1918, which was the third official full year of the Assemblies of God, the year that the Spanish flu was ravaging the nation, the year that our country in the United States, if you're not part of the United States, then forget what I'm saying. It was the year, actually, in 1918, that they tried to provoke Mexico to go to war with the United States and try to join sides and be in opposition and bring the war to this continent. Now, in that year, where everything was upside down, what would you expect to have happened amongst the missions department of the Assemblies of God? And you can think about what you will, and I will give you my personal experience here in our country, in this world, right now, because I have an eye on what's going on amongst our missions department in Mexico. Unfortunately, a number of churches have, in the middle of the crisis, in the middle of the needs that they're seeing, after all, if they're going to have services, now they have to have less people. They have to have bought all of the equipment to have the people come in. They have to do all of these extra steps. And so as a result, a number of our Assembly of God churches here in Mexico, as well as I have some indication from others that it's not only in Mexico, but worldwide, the missions offerings began to go down. Fortunately, a lot of the missionaries had money in their accounts to be able to sustain them throughout these months. But let me tell you what happened in 1918, because they didn't have a big account to be able to sustain them. In 1918, the Department of Foreign Missions reported that the missions giving amongst the Assembly of God churches that year, when everything was upside down, they were in World War I, and the Spanish flu was going on, when it was affecting all of the churches, that year, missions went up 3 times. Tripled. And I have to believe it has something to do with their absolute commitment to global evangelism. We are going to create or do something, they say, that is going to impact the world. Now, here is where we are. Today, we have churches around the world, not just Assembly of God churches, but churches in general. And some of those churches are committed with one focus to promote Jesus Christ. But there are a lot of churches, in especially the Western Hemisphere, that have gotten entrenched in this prosperity thinking, that it's about how I should feel better. That was not a part of the vocabulary in 1918. That was not even a consideration. They were willing to sacrifice. And you know, it's crazy, some of the things that we think about sacrificing. And I'm going to get back to you in just a moment. But I remember when I was growing up, they were promoting sacrifices like giving up 1 Coke a week. No, I'm sorry to make fun, but literally, is that a sacrifice? Think about what was going on. If you were to go back to when missions began as an idea in the modern church, amongst the Moravian church, this church started off just wanting to be focused on themselves. They were in a commune, if you will. Everyone wanted to care for themselves. And God, after what is recorded as the longest prayer meeting in history, 100-year-long prayer meeting, 24 hours a day that was taking place there, they were convinced by God that they needed to go out and minister. And if you were to start to look at the statistics, their ability to send missionaries was far greater than the numbers in their church. And the reason for that is roughly 1/3 of them sold themselves as slaves to give the money to missions. Now, let me ask you a question. If you were to put on a scale the comparison of one pastor years ago saying, if you just give up 1 Coke a week, to 100+ people selling themselves as slaves 24 hours a day for the rest of their lives, how do you even compare that? Where are we today? Where are we today? You see, in that day, the urgency of reaching the lost and the expectation of Christ's imminent return drove them. It drove the Apostle Paul, and it drove the Assemblies of God in those days. What urgency are we facing today? Are we worried about how we are going to be affected? Or are we concerned about the urgent need? Because if Jesus comes back tonight, folks, there's a lot of people who have never heard the name. There is a need out there for us to respond as disciples. Do we spend more time and energy promoting today conspiracy theories or Jesus? I get messages all the time. I get emails. Oh, Pastor, did you see this? Did you see that? You know what? I'm sorry, but no, I didn't care to see it. I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but there's times when we just say, all of this is fluff. It doesn't matter. What matters is that they hear about Jesus. Proverbs 5:21 says, "For your ways are in full view of the Lord, and he examines all your paths." God is watching you. God knows the intention of your heart, and you cannot fool him. God comes along and he says, what is the highest priority? And if our highest priority is making sure that our life stays easy, making sure that our life is correct, making sure that we have what we have always enjoyed in the past, then we're going to be just doing the same thing over and over again. But when God is the focus of our hearts, we transform the world. This is what happened in 1918. I was looking at that picture and I said, how is it that the people living in that generation changed their world, and the people in our generation in 2020 as a whole, not every one of them, there are some that are very committed, don't get me wrong. Matter of fact, I'll just mention that this church this year has increased its missions giving by 70%. So I'm not saying this to reprimand by any stretch of the imagination. But we need to be people who look at the situation and we say, it's an opportunity. We aren't walking by fear, but rather seeing the opportunity of what God has in store for us. God knows where every one of our paths are leading. God knows if we are heading into disaster before we get there, or if we're heading into revival. And I want to tell you something. I believe that he has something in store right now. In the middle of the war to end all wars, in the middle of the worst health crisis that the world had seen to date. Because if you were to start to put on, and as a matter of fact, that picture with the police officers in Seattle, I was just getting prepared this morning, and my daughter was there looking over my shoulder at the PowerPoint, and I said, well, it looks all okay. And she says, what was that picture about the coronavirus? It wasn't the coronavirus, it was in 1918. Sometimes we think that, we've never seen this before. But we have. We have. God looks at the situation in which the world feels like it's collapsing, the war to end all wars, the worst calamity, the worst collapse economically. Everything is bad, and we can say that that's the impression upon the world. And you go from country to country to country, and you can see the economic impact that the coronavirus has had. Here in Mexico, they stated this last week that it's had an economic impact of 18% of the economy has fallen in Mexico since the beginning. That was just this last week, the statistics. His plan, the plan of God, though, remains the same. His plan remains the same. And you know what? He never has a lack. Let me just share with you. Mexico's financial impact is 18% less right now. The United States, European countries, you go across and around the world, and they have some greater and some less, depending on how they have responded to the problem with the coronavirus. And all of them are showing an impact. But let me tell you something. God's economy has not been impacted. God is still in control. God is still in charge. And his plan remains the same. 2 Peter 3:9 says, the Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. God does not just see our physical paths, but he sees every path. He sees what our character choices are making. He knows where we're headed, our personal choices for hobbies and styles. Because God sees the end as clearly as the beginning. He's the one that's best able to determine the correct path right now. Now, I tend to travel a great deal in what I do. And there's times when I'll be on a particular road or highway. And for example, a couple of weeks ago, I was with my family and we were on the highway somewhere between Guadalajara and Ciudad Guzman. If you don't know where that is, it didn't make that much importance for me to remember what the name of the city was. But anyway, as we were getting close, because we were caravanning in two separate cars, my wife calls me up on the phone and says, where's going to be the next bathroom? Because Elijah needs to use the bathroom. We're out on the highway. Now, why would she call me? Well, because I'd been there before. I could say, well, right here we are. It's going to be 5 more minutes to the next toll booth. And then after the toll booth, it's about 4 miles to the next gas station that has a bathroom. So it'll be about 10 minutes. Okay. She couldn't say that. Why? Because she didn't know. And sometimes we live in the situation where we don't know, and we think that we're capable of making the wisest decisions. If you say, in 10 more minutes, there's going to be a bathroom, all of a sudden it doesn't make sense to pull off and let him try to go to the bathroom on the side of the highway. Hello? When we trust that God knows where we're at, we can move forward. A person who has traveled the path then is a reliable guide. And Jesus has already traveled the path. Jesus is walking with us, and he is the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. Let me read for you what it says in Matthew 16, verses 21 to 25. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the 3rd day be raised to life. You think Jesus knew what was going to happen? He kind of gives that impression, doesn't he? He already knows. So that he could tell his disciples, I know what's happening in my life, but I also know what's happening in your life. Reading on in verse 22, it says, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. After all, Peter knows best, right? How many have ever been a Peter? Yeah, I knew best too. There's been many times in my life I knew better. And I could take God aside and say, you know what, God, let me explain to you how it really is going to go. And God has never yet taken my suggestion. What happens here, it says, this is never going to happen. He took him aside to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. I wonder if Jesus ever says that same phrase to his church today. You're a stumbling block to me. You have your own concerns in mind, not my own, not mine. What was Jesus' concern? We already read it from Peter, that all should come to repentance, that none should perish. And yet the church is still worried about making sure everybody's comfortable and how it's going to affect us personally. Then Jesus said to his disciples in verse 24, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. Church in the Western Hemisphere has kind of misread this, I think. Because some of the things that when we ask people in the churches today, what does Jesus mean when he's talking about taking up your cross? They'll talk about all kinds of things. They'll talk about, oh, you know what, I'm just struggling losing weight. I have a feeling that Jesus was talking about more than just our struggle with our weight when he says take up a cross. Or your pastor, I am significantly colorblind. And I had to, because I got this new shirt, a wonderful new shirt. According to my wife, this is salmon color. And so I had to ask her this morning, does this sports coat go with that shirt? That's my cross to bear. What do we think about when we say cross? Oh, I can't do that. I can't do this. Oh, this thing, these terrible things. Jesus is speaking about a cross that is different. That's the difference between life and death. Taking up your cross and having one sole focus. Making sure that the people are ready to go to heaven. This life would be so incredibly rewarding, Jesus tells his disciples. If you take up your cross, if you only follow me, you're going to be so fulfilled. But I'm going to tell you, it's going to come at a high price. It's going to cost you everything. And you start to look at those disciples that heard him say that. What was true about them? They were all killed. Well, they were all killed except for one. And it wasn't because the government didn't try. We're living in a generation where there are more martyrs year by year than ever before, and primarily in another continent. And we've gotten comfortable in the Western Hemisphere amongst the church that says, oh, we're supposed to be like this and it's okay. But you know what? Jesus is still saying the same thing. You must take up your cross and follow me. If you don't do that, if you're not wholehearted and committed to me, you're going to lose your life. But if you lose it for my sake, then you'll find it. Jesus is coming back for a church that is wholly committed. And I have to look back at the history lesson and say, wow, I would have loved to have been a part of the Assemblies of God in 1918. I would have loved to have been a part of these movements that were committed wholeheartedly. They were going for it. They had nothing in reserve. But then years go by. We build bigger churches, more comfortable pews. And we begin to think that it's all about us. And a selfish gospel invades. I thank the Lord again that we aren't in that situation where this selfish gospel has invaded. But then again, I wonder, has it? And we start to look at our comfort level in regards, even with increasing missions by 70%. Are we doing what we absolutely could do? Are we as committed as we can be? Every week, and I thank you, every week we have literally hundreds of people who come by to get free water in front of our church, free drinking water. And I can talk to a handful of them a week because there are just so many. So last week we gave out over 100 food rations. And we share the gospel with them. We even, sometimes they're going out so fast that we can't even, it's not possible to share the full gospel, but we always give them tracts with those food rations. I thank the Lord that we're able to do what we can do, but then I look back and I say, is it enough? Is it enough? Or are we being more impacted by the coronavirus, by fear, by the net around us that says, oh, this is your cross to bear. You know, after all, today, you're not going to be able to have that Coke. It's your cross to bear. After all, you can't enjoy all of the colors of the rainbow. And when the jacaranda trees are in full bloom and everyone is saying, wow, it's so beautiful. And you say, okay, that's my cross to bear. But I don't think that's what Jesus was talking about. Jesus isn't talking about the light things. You know, it's interesting because Jesus preferred in our text to get rid of Peter than to have God's plan stopped. Peter shows up and he says, this will never happen to you, Jesus. It's not going to happen. And Jesus has a natural affinity for Peter. He's walked and ministered, and he's one of his inner circle. He's his friend, right? And when your friend tells you something, it pulls on your heartstrings. And he says, you know, you're going to be a stumbling block to me. You're pulling on my emotions. And so what does he say? He says, get behind me, Satan. You know, I'll tell you, that's probably a rather aggressive statement. When my wife says something that I don't like, if I were to dare to look at her and say, get behind me, Satan, if I were able to come to church the next Sunday, and I say if because there's a good possibility I'd be in the hospital, but if I were able to come to church the next Sunday, I would have black and blue eyes and all kinds of. This was a statement that Jesus says to Peter. He would rather not have Peter, his prized pupil, if you will, the one that later on was going to give him this statement. And he says, on that statement, on your faith, I'm going to establish my church, and it's going to impact the entire world. This guy that was going to be crucial to the moving of the gospel, Jesus says, I'd rather get rid of you than to stop the gospel. When we're driven by our own plans over God's, we're acting like Satan. When we put ourselves in first place for the highest priority, what Christian wants to have Satan as their example? You know, what are you going to do this week? Oh, I'm going to try to be more like Satan. You don't hear church members say that. But what do? They go out and they do the things that please them all day long, week after week. When God says, I want you to impact the world, represent me. Tell everyone about Jesus. Send missionaries around the world. Do what you can do because you are giving up your life. Your life is no longer yours. In other words, Jesus comes and he says, remember those people that sold themselves into slavery? That's you. You no longer have a choice. We want Jesus as our example. The bigger the problem we face, the greater the temptation to evaluate it according to how it impacts us. I know that from personal experience. You know how, if it's a personal problem, if it's something personal to you, it impacts you. Let me give you an example. How many have ever had a personal tragedy in your life? I'll give you an example, such as an accident or somebody died all of a sudden, these things. Those things impact you, don't they? They impact you. I mean, that night, I remember when my brother was in his automobile accident, the whole world was turned upside down for our family. It left him a paraplegic, and he's a paraplegic to this day, from 15 years of age to now. And this year, he's going to be 50. Boy, he's old. I won't mention the fact that he's my younger brother. And that impacted not only his life, but all of the family. As we had a scramble, we were going to another part of the country to be able to be in a specialty hospital with all of the rehabilitation and all of these things. I remember sleepless nights and the frustrating lives. You know, that was because it impacted us personally. And then we could tell some of my friends, oh, pray for me because this has happened. You know what? I wasn't there. But I have to believe that my friends prayed for us, but we're able to sleep that night. Because it wasn't their calamity. It didn't impact them the same way that it impacted me. And all too often, we have this being Jesus and his issue, and it doesn't impact us. And the bigger the problem that we face, the more we say, oh, poor me. It's impacting me. It's affecting me. We can laugh about the coronavirus until it affected our finances, until a family member of ours passes away, until it impacts us. And then we say, oh, the coronavirus, and then we were all terrified about it. But Jesus died on a cross. And he sent us out, and it is the thing that has impacted him. How do you evaluate it? God's plan, according to what he told those disciples, was that Jesus and then every one of the disciples, it would cost their lives. I'm going to be handed over to the chief priests, teachers of the law. They're going to try me. They're going to crucify me. On the third day, I'm going to be raised from the dead. And then you take up your cross every day and follow me. It was going to cost Jesus his life and every disciple. It may be a life that you give to Jesus like John's. They tried to kill you multiple times, but they couldn't. Or it may be a life where you actually physically are killed for your faith. But those are the only two choices for a disciple. The ones who are committed, saying, Jesus is above all. What is the force that most impacts your life today? sickness of a loved one, current financial situation, a hobby. There's all kinds of reports that I'm reading that say there's an increase in the sale of this and this other thing and these other things as people are looking for a hobby to be able to distract them from the cares and distress of the world around them. This last Wednesday in Bible study, I mentioned that I had purchased a treadmill. And it was interesting to me because I bought a treadmill because I didn't want to run out on the rock road and had twisted my ankle so many times. And I came across an article that said that treadmill sales have gone up 3 times since the coronavirus, since the quarantine, because people were afraid to go out on the street. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. And you can find all of these different things that are increasing in the middle of the catastrophes that we're facing because people are trying to get distracted. But you don't find very many things that are like the threefold increase, like in 1918, the Assemblies of God sending out missionaries. You don't come across the churches and say, I haven't read an article recently. It says, the churches are doubling down. They're ministering to more people. They're preaching the gospel. They're evangelizing more on the streets. They're out with missionaries. Some are, but it's not these great news stations because as a general whole, it's not happening. A few here and a few there. If it's not the hobby, if it's not the sickness, if it's not a financial concern, is it that God wants everyone to come to know Him? He does. God knows all the details of our lives and of the world. He knows all of our paths. That's what that scripture says. He knows everything that's happening in the world and is still in charge. He continues to have His focus on that one thing, that everyone come into relationship with Him. So what's your plan as a Christian? What's your call? I hear some people and say, you know what, my gifting isn't in evangelism. My gifting isn't in these particular things. You know what, Jesus didn't ask His disciples what their gifting were. He just said, go. He just said, go. Now, you may be less effective, but you're out there doing it. We go. Because we are disciples. And we have committed our lives because God is watching our paths. And He knows what we're doing. And He knows how we spend our days because we are disciples. We serve Him. Bow your heads with me if you will.